Tim, you want to go and give the safety?
Sure. Welcome. You're on the 9th floor of the west side of Energy Plaza. In the event that we need to exit this building, we would be led by our security group to the appropriate spot, but in the event of a storm, we would actually go to the down to the main level and into the call center area. In the event we need to exit the building, we would take the elevators down to the main level, exit out on the 17th Street side. Unless there is a fire, we wouldn't use the elevators. We'd actually use the steps, take the steps all the way down to the main level and exit out on the 17th Street side of the building. The fire extinguisher is right behind me. The AED and the first aid kit are to the right of the elevators, one on top of each other. Is anybody here certified in the use of an AED or in CPR? Very good. All right, thank you. If you have a medical condition, please write it down or tell your neighbor. Are there any questions to the safety briefing at all? Seeing none, I'll turn that back over to you, Chairman Kavanaugh.
Tom's not here yet, so why don't we skip over nuclear and just go to systems management? Rick, you want to start?
Sure.
Somebody was on the ball. Thank you very much. So we start off, I think, with contracts over $500,000. In who's catching that? Thank you, Mary.
Calgon Carbon Corporation. It is a $7,625,000 contract. It is for the activated carbon for our facilities at Nebraska City 1 and 2. It's a 5-year contract, has escalation in it, and we're asking for your permission for reporting this contract has been executed.
What was the value of that contract the last time you signed it?
The last time we signed it was independent of NC1 and NC2, so the two were separated. Okay. And I believe they were running about $1 million to $1.5 million each, okay. Just depending on
per year.
Per year, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mary, can you explain to all our listeners what activated carbon does? For NC1
Activated
and NC2?
carbon is what we inject in to collect mercury from the system, and so this is to meet our MATS compliance, so the mercury, pulling it out of the emissions, and we collect that into the activated carbon and then replenish it periodically.
Thank you.
On the fly ash, are they using that still? What do they use that for? Concrete?
Fly ash from NC1 is sold to a company.
They're
yes.
still using it?
Yes.
I heard they weren't going to use it anymore.
NC1, but not NC2.
Okay. Will that continue, that they can continue to use it in other ways? Or?
Yes, on NC1 we can continue to use it and continue to, we have a contractor on site that removes it daily.
Yeah, okay. I thought I read somewhere that they couldn't use it or whatever they were going to use it for, and then I was thinking, oh, it's going to pile up on us then? Or what?
Yeah, no, NC2 is the one that we can't
good.
use.
All right.
Is there any questions for this question? Okay. Can you go on and talk about the fly ash recycle? Good segue there.
Yes. We are requesting permission to go out and negotiate a contract as opposed to go to a sealed bid process for our fly ash recycle and flue gas recirculation system. We are doing that specifically because of the history of this system. As the components were built, the original equipment provider did not meet the requirements that we had for performance guarantees. At that time, we did have several conversations with them. They did several $1 million worth of modifications to the system. We also got liquidated damages for them, or from them, excuse me, for the fact that they did not meet their performance guarantees. Since that time on NC2, we've been doing a number of modifications, trying to get the performance back into alignment where we would like to have had it. This, I think, is one that we believe, given kind of the preliminary information that we have from the owner's engineer, that we could do better on our recycle, or better on our lime usage if we were to recycle the ash. And the way that I understand that works is that as you recycle the ash, the module actually becomes bigger, and so the surface area is larger, and so you're going to attract more SO2 as it goes through. So We would like to go out and negotiate this contract because of the complexity of our system. Our system is different from anyone else's because of the issues that we had in 2009 when it was built. And so we do have some very specific things that we need to talk with them about, as well as we would like to be able to talk to different contractors about performance guarantees that we can get out of this system as we go forward.
So, thank you. The way that I understand the engineer certification here is that he said that there, as you just repeated, you know, that there was original equipment put in. The OEM then went back in because the performance expectations were not met and tried to tweak that. Still not met, so now we're going to someone else.
Correct.
To see if we can't get the performance that we expected out of the original equipment.
Or better performance than we have today. Better
performance than we have today. What kind of, has there been any process changes to ensure that that expected performance will be delivered on our side? That's
part of what we want to do with these contractors as they come in. We want to talk to them about what they would provide to us and what that would look like so that we would understand that. So that's part of why we want to go to a negotiation as opposed to a sealed bid process, so that we can talk to them about different performance guarantees that would come in as part of what their proposal would be. So we don't want to presuppose what any one vendor would bring in. We want to talk to each one of them and understand what they would propose.
Okay.
And some of that would be some of the history that they've had, some of the experience that they've had, and examples that we may engage with them about showing where they've done it. We may want to do a site visit and where they've done some of this work and the success of it by our interview of others that they've done business with.
And again, because our system is different, it will be different. We need to get them in and actually take a look at our system, do some walk downs at the site so that we can have those types of discussions.
Okay. And there's no regulatory issue here, right?
No.
Yeah, this is just about us being as efficient as we can.
This is to improve efficiency of the line, yes, the usage of our line.
Other question?
Okay. In Mr. Bruckner's letter, the district is required to advertise its intention in any such contract in one or more newspapers. So that's the floor, right, for notifying. I assume we've got a sense for and know who potential vendors are.
We do.
I would assume it's a relatively small number that would.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about what that process is by how we determine who we're going to talk with?
I can. I'm not sure that I have all the information you might need, but
sure.
We typically look at different vendors that have done this across the industry.
Mm-hmm.
We will ask for references as they come in and put their bids in. So as we go through this process, we'll be looking at, back to I think what Director Yoder was alluding to, how they've performed at other areas and what sort of success rates they've had. We do have an owner's engineer that has come in and is advising us on that. We're utilizing HDR, and so we're also taking their input, and they're helping us to identify those vendors that we believe would be qualified to do this going forward.
Perfect. Thank you.
Director Gay, did you have something else? All right. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Going back to the agenda, we have one other item, and that's the multi-year contract option. Mo?
Sure. As you recall, last month, the board approved the contract to purchase 2 auto transformers, one to replace an aging and critical auto, and the other one is for a spare to improve the resiliency. In the request for proposal, there was an option that we did not include in the resolution. That was an oversight on our part. The option would allow OPPD to have additional 4 one-year renewal terms. So after we purchase those 2 in the future, we can call on that option if the terms are favorable to OPPD. So that would be with Hyundai, and they do have an escalation and de-escalation provisions and formula that we're very satisfied with. So this is basically just part of that contract that you approved last month, but this here to make sure that you're approving the option in case we need it. So questions?
Well, does that just guarantee us kind of a placeholder in line?
Correct.
Is that what it is?
For 4 years, yeah. Okay. 4 single year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it unusual to have options when it comes to dealing with purchasing transformers, considering it's a pretty volatile
It
price,
is,
isn't it?
and that's why you have that formula that you can escalate the price, and that would depend on the price of copper, steel, the labor market. That has happened before, and you know, as long as the vendor and OPPD is agreeable to that, and everything is really very transparent, then it's, you know, it's very
Okay.
good.
Is there any charge for the options, or is it just included?
It was part of the request for proposal, so it's all included, no additional charge. It's part of, I believe it was $5.9 million for those two.
Okay.
So transformers being a critical element and tough. The flow on the transformers is tough.
Absolutely, and we do have a, you know, large plan that would include buying a couple more in the future, so this would be a very good option to have in case we need it.
So this item plus the previous item on the fly ash recycle are going to be action items, and thank you for your report. Oh, I'm sorry.
Not related to this, but I think this is for system management. I just read in the paper, the president said he's going to do what he can do to keep nuclear plants open and coal plants open. Nuclear, that ship has sailed, obviously, but we don't need to do it today because I'm throwing this out there. But at some point, what do we, or who follows that, or can we get a report on what's that's all about? If he's going to prop up the coal industry or whatever, how that affects our plants, our production, and it doesn't need to be a big deal today, but I do think that's something we should follow of what's happening.
Sure, I don't think there's any details around any of that, and so obviously this is kind of early in that game. But as they become apparent and as whatever that policy may look like becomes developed, we'll share with the board what that looks like. Certainly Seth, certainly our generation folks, our environmental folks will be actively involved. Lisa's team, Mary's team will be actively involved in kind of what's going on in that. But as we get some more details around that, our industry folks will also be paying a lot of attention, whether that's the Large Public Power Council, American Public Power Council, will be paying a lot of attention to that, understand what that looks like. So as we get more information, we'll share that either through Director's Update or through a direct communication with the board.
And I didn't expect it. I just think it's something, it could be all bluster too, but it's something
Keep an eye on.
just I think we should be aware of.
Sure,
as a
absolutely.
policy issue.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, ever since Perry and DOE tried the rule change with NERC and that kind of subsided, and this is a new attempt, and I think we'll continue to see those attempts. So yeah, having a report is great.
So.
Hey, Mary, I have one quick question. At the last board meeting, Mr. Laverne Thrayon said OPPD is not an energy producer, it's a fly ash maker. I know that's not exactly correct or barely correct, but I just wanted to know, how do you respond to that, and what do we make in sales, or do we sell our fly ash? Is it profitable? And
So in July, we have a SD9, SD7 monitoring report that's due, and at that time, we'll address what we do with our fly ash, what the volumes were, how much of it we are getting sold, that sort of thing. So we'll do that at that monitoring report, if that's okay.
okay.
And as a follow-up to that, the IAC does get and publish the amount that we receive.
What's the IAs?
Sorry, the what am I thinking of? The Energy Administration.
EIA.
EIA, thank you. Those TLAs, those three-letter acronyms. So the EIA does get our information. It does publish the information on how much money we get and how much we actually sell. So if Laverne is interested, that information is publicly available.
But I would just contend the amount that we get on the sale of fly ash significantly dwarfs the $1 billion in revenue that we get from the generation and the sale of electricity.
Of our byproduct.
Of our byproduct.
Right. It's a good byproduct.
The big thing is that you're getting rid of some of the fly ash. You know, I know, like, you know, it can be used in, you know, that cement siding or something like that. It can be used in roads and, you know, a lot of
Yeah,
other
we're not
places.
landfilling all of it, right?
Yeah, we're
selling
not
what we can.
landfilling it. We're not putting it in the landfills. We're actually using it.
Some of it.
or some of it, the ones that we can.
That we can.
Orange light.
And is it harmful? I mean, just by looking at, you know, I don't need a briquette, a charcoal briquette, because it's burnt.
It is deemed by the EPA to be a non-hazardous material.
Okay,
After quite a bit of discussion.
okay, you got it. That's all I have. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Which there usually is on any EPA ruling after a lot of discussion. So, absolutely, absolutely.
Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
Okay, let's go back to nuclear, Tom.
I'm going to pass it off to Mary Fisher. It's Mary Fisher Day.
Thank you, Director Barrett. I have 3 things I just wanted to report on quickly here. The incipient fire brigade, we've been talking about that for a few months. That's a milestone for the plant. That was initiated on May 1st. And really what it does is it changes the requirements that we have at the station to fight a fire. We'll call local fire departments in order to come over and help us out. We do have a contract set up with Blair Volunteer Fire Department, and they have been trained about the FCS specifics. So that's another milestone in this decommissioning. Also, our security changes, we talked a little bit about that. Security Phase 2 has been implemented, successfully implemented, I might add. And we are moving on to Phase 3. Phase 3 occurs when the fuel is on the pad. And so we are now trying to get ready for that. And we have several studies, or excuse me, we're getting a study back in from a contractor to help us with what that might look like, as well as doing some benchmarking at other facilities that have gone through this before us. So well on our way to make sure that we meet the milestone of when the fuel is on the pad to downgrade the security that will then be commensurate with that status at the plant. And then last but not least, our dry fuel storage project continues. And I had Christy load some pictures for me. If you remember in April, this was the last picture that I showed you. In March, they were putting down this pad. Christy, if you go to the next one. So this is a picture of top and then the wall that goes to the horizontal cask. And so you can see the construction is well underway. One more. Here is the mold in which they use. They pour concrete into that mold. You can see all the rebar around it. And there's concrete in there. I don't know if you can tell that. That's okay, Christy. That's fine. And here's some of the finished products. If you look at that, starting at the very end, you see the plate with the round circular piece on it. That's the door that will go in those holes that you see on the facilities on the right, or the horizontal cast modules on the right. The flat pieces that you see are the tops. They'll actually come in and sit on top of the horizontal modules that you see there on the right, and then obviously the horizontal modules on the right. They do these in components, so you see 3, 3, and 3. So they're gearing these up. We have 30 to 32 of these to build, so well on their way.
What kind of testing is done of the materials during
concrete
construction?
Yeah, the concrete is tested as it comes in before it's put into the mold. It's also tested, you know, you do it like an hour later, 6 hours later, 8 hours later. I'm not sure what the time frames are, but it's tested well up into 24 hours later to make sure that the strength is there. They also are bringing the aggregate in from Minnesota. It has a very special aggregate that needs to come in, and so they're bringing that in from Minnesota to make sure that the concrete mix is correct. I will add, that's perfect segue into the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and that was what our nuclear oversight team is doing. One of the things that they are doing is making sure that this goes well, and so they're out there monitoring what goes on. And so they've been very involved in this. They've also gone and monitored where they're building the cask, the actual metal cask, to make sure that that's going appropriate. So we have the proper quality assurance focus on this project. And just other things that our Nuclear Oversight Committee is doing. They did an internal assessment, which was really to look at our occupational radiation exposure, rad waste treatment, effluent monitoring, and solid waste radioactive waste management and transport. We do these assessments typically in front of when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is going to come in, just to make sure we don't have any flaws in our system. And they had one finding, which was basically what I would call a minor problem with some paperwork that they had on one sheet of paper that they found. So all in all, a very good internal assessment. They also did an internal audit, and I think I talked about this last time. It was a very broad audit, and they did end up with one finding, 10 deficiencies and 5 enhancements for the breadth of that audit. I believe that that was probably as well as we could have anticipated. All of those really associated, again, with some minor paperwork things that we've now corrected. Procedures, make sure the procedures are in alignment with the paperwork and make sure everything is moving smoothly. And that's the end of my report.
I have one question about the Nuclear Oversight Committee now. What kind of benchmarking? Do they have the opportunity to go to other areas as far as the dry cast storage, as far as their knowledge of how to assess this or evaluate this? Can you talk about any type of benchmarking that they get or receive?
That's a great question. We do a lot of benchmarking even now. I think as we went into decommissioning, we did a lot of benchmarking just to understand the whole process. And now we definitely are focused on what's happening with others. I know that they visited Kewaunee and Crystal River, both of which have recently put all of their fuel into cask. And now we're looking at what's happened after you've put your fuel into cask, where your system's going, what are the other things that you're doing to move towards just a pad only. And that's where we're getting some of the security information. I will mention that our NOS manager conducted an independent management review at Humboldt Bay recently. He went up there specifically because he wanted to see what their QA program looked like once the fuel was on the pad. So we continue to do industry audits as well in order to gain some of that benchmarking information.
Thank you.
Mary, quick question on the security study. This specifically reads with design and construction to follow. I assume that the study also includes procedural staffing, or can you give me a summary for the scope of that study?
Yep, the study is really to look at the physical configuration that we need to go to, so what it would take to build it, how we should build it, what sort of where it should be built. All of the processes and procedures will follow after we get the construction design done, so that we can understand what that might look like. The study specifically is looking at different ways that different people have implemented this phase 3 security, and then we will actually put an RFP together and go out for bid on it. So we're just kind of in that initial stage of trying to understand what that might look like.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions? No? All right. You're welcome.
As you can see, we have corporate officer compensation discussions. Those will take place in executive closed session at the end of this morning's meetings. And those will be on review Timothy Burke, Julie Comstock, Javier Fernandez, and Lisa Olson's reviews and comp discussion. And then we've got several other things due. I'll turn it over to Mart right now. We got some severance agreements over $50,000.
Yes, so we had 3 individuals who were impacted in the accountable management system reorganization in business technology and building services. We also had one in the finance area. And so these are the settlement agreements that were over $50,000 for those individuals. 2 of them have retired. So.
Any questions? Those are in your book. You see there's 3 of those. Looks like they several of these employees must have been here quite some time.
Employees, yes.
So they choose either to be redeployed or retire, or that's what happened. Any questions on that from anybody?
Mark, I have a question. When someone has been here and they can retire, do they still get a severance package?
Yeah, so the decision to redeploy and to offer the severance package is completely separate from retirement.
Okay.
People have their own option to retire or not retire.
Okay.
We don't force that. So
All right.
If they're eligible, sometimes they do, sometimes they wait.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So is that that's just a reporting item for you? All right, I don't see any questions on that. And then Scott Foch has a enterprise risk management monitoring report we're going to do.
We closed.
Oh, is that the close? That's closed one.
No, the monitoring report
No, the monitoring report and then
Have a deeper discussion about
quarterly
risk in
update.
closed session.
Right.
Good morning and thank you.
Thanks,
Yes, you
Scott.
have me for a couple of items here this morning. The first one is the monitoring report. The last time we reviewed this was June 15th of 2017, and this is on SD15 Enterprise Risk Management. As a reminder, SD15 is a policy on enterprise risk. It's stated here, and what we'll do is we'll go through each one of the component parts to demonstrate our thoughts on how we're in compliance with the policy. The first component, to ensure the district is maintaining an ERM program that fulfills this policy. When designing the program, it was important for us to see and ensure that we had alignment with the board and kind of where the board was going. So as you see up here, there are the board committees, and we wanted to make an effort to ensure that senior management oversight for risk committees were kind of aligned if they're hearing or there's issues that are emerging through those committees, to make sure those kind of risks are fed into the conversation of overall corporate risk. So there are roles that senior management serves here, and then they meet. We meet as a senior management team in an executive ERM committee on a quarterly basis. And then there are ERM working committees, and each working committee has a committee chair that's at the direct report level. In this case, for governance and public information, it's Tim O'Brien. For finance, insurance, and audit, it's John Thurber, and for system management, it's Tim McAreevy. I want to introduce Dan Laskowski, who is in the room. He is the fearless manager of this program, and really a lot of the brains behind it. I just get to stand up here and report out on the exceptional work of the group and the committee. So thank you, Dan, for all that you do to make this come to life. A couple of things. So we have a sense really of what the structure is. This provides a little bit of detail around the process. We have the SD15, and we also have a policy that guides the responsibilities and procedures. With regards to risk identification and oversight, on a monthly basis, we have the three ERM committees meet, and they discuss risk. They identify them. It's important to know that the people that are attending or a part of these committees are at the mostly at the direct report level, with a few approved exceptions, and those exceptions are usually driven by subject matter expertise or ability to really get in and to understand risks at the level that we would want those discussions to occur. These meetings actually occur monthly, as we said, and with the exception of 1 month where we had systems management. It was during the month of August. That was canceled because they were actually ahead of their agenda and they were doing better than performed, and they didn't need to meet, but every other committee had met on a monthly basis. Also, I think important to note is that the committee meetings have a combined meeting in December, which becomes a way of stepping away from the regular issue of risk that they're looking at on a monthly basis, and really taking a forward look. What are the emerging risks? What are the things that we know and see on the horizon, and how do we then incorporate that into our overall risk register and how we think about risk? Recently, too, I want to say that Dan has been leading business unit level conversations, so pulling away from the enterprise a little bit, what risks might be emerging within a particular business unit, and how are we creating awareness of risk within that would naturally emerge within the course of business units conducting their business. And then both the senior management team and the executive and the board of directors meet on a quarterly basis. And the senior management team is really tasked with affirming, are these risks, are we identifying all enterprise risks to the reasonable extent? Are they understood, and are we effectively mitigating them? Another component of the policy is to review the district's most significant risks on a quarterly basis to validate assumptions and assess impacts of changes since initial risk review. You are meeting on a quarterly basis. In fact, today in closed session, we will have a discussion on the risks. This may look familiar to all of you, but this is a risk matrix that guides our understanding and how we determine what significant risk is. It looks at the likelihood of an event or a risk event happening over a 5-year time horizon, as well as the severity of the impact that we perceive. So again, in this committee discussions at the level of direct report, oftentimes supported by SMEs and with some oversight from senior management, do we have a good understanding of this risk, and do we have an agreement around where it sits with regards to this matrix? And as a board, you review the the red risks, the ones that align to the highest level of severity as well as likelihood. The next component of policy, when necessary, request additional explanation of the risks from the corresponding senior manager responsible for risk, or request additional expertise to supplement the review. I want to pause here for just a second and just highlight, we've talked about strategy, we've talked about structure. This is an important point to highlight people. We have quite a few people involved. In addition to the senior management team and the committee chairs, there are 33 primary risk committee members that are participating, reviewing, discussing risk, and 30 backups. So if a primary is never attending, there is a backup, which is ensuring cross-functional representation and discussion of the risk. The primary members are all selected by the vice president, ensuring kind of the right level of involvement. All the board really needs to do in terms of getting information around additional risk is talk to the senior manager owner. You'll be hearing from the senior manager risk owners today on the red, but they are in a position to provide any information, additional information that you might need with regards to a risk. And finally, review additional ERM information, related risk activities, and strategies on an as-needed basis. I think it's important to highlight that ERM, in addition to having a system, understanding of risk, quantification of risk, and a system that's meeting on a regular basis, this information is really used in driving and supporting decisions we're making as an organization. It's leveraged during our annual strategic planning process, and we develop the plan, we understand risk, and we're incorporating our thoughts into that risk. With regards to business unit planning, we have the same kind of discussion, and when it comes to capital projects, it's actually been incorporated into the discipline of taking a look at a capital project. Significant decisions are driven by a business decision model template. That template that comes to senior management team to present the story or the business case also includes risk in it, so risk needs to be addressed at that time. And then recent board recommendations have included risk-related information. You may or may not know it. Behind the scenes, the teams that are working on these decisions are also considering risk, actively considering risk in terms of what risks might we be incurring here. And as a result, it influences and shapes the recommendations. So we thought this was interesting to highlight because although additional information has not necessarily been requested, you are getting it all of the time through the kinds of decisions you're thinking about and contemplating here. So this was submitted to the Governance Committee for review and comment, and the Governance Committee is recommending the acceptance of this monitoring report, finding OPPD to be sufficiently in compliance. Are there any questions or comments? None? Seeing none?
So this will be on the Thursday?
Yes, it'll be on
for action. And then I guess I'd just say, obviously, in exec, when we go into exec, the reason why we're doing that is there's going to be discussion of security for district property and utility infrastructure, so we don't want to, for obvious reasons, discuss that here in open session. So with that, also, I guess I got a quick question. So when we're all having our other meetings, you know, committee meetings, we're discussing these risks all the time. So this is more for public consumption, that we're discussing these risks. I think this is one of the most important things we do, obviously, is avoid the big risk that comes up, smacks us behind the head. And knock on wood, we've done a good job of that because of this policy since we started implementing it. So important thing. So okay, with that, oh, go ahead,
One
Craig.
quick question. So I just want to kind of make sure I understand our process here. Question one, are we in compliance, right? And that would be on the consent agenda. So then we stop there. Question two, are any revisions? Do we need to have? I don't have any, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah, we're asking that now. Right now, the way I understand it
right?
is, you know, we've reviewed it, and yeah, our recommendation, it's good.
Yeah.
He just reported. If at this time you'd have any changes, or you say, I don't think it's good, you raise your hand and say,
Revisions to the policy.
I want this
Right, yeah,
revisions.
I'm differentiating.
Then we
right.
would decide does that make sense to go back and look at it again?
Yeah.
In this case, of course, we don't. But that's how it works, yeah. So right now, we've got an action item on Thursday, probably on consent, and to approve what we've got. And I guess another question I'd have then, to follow up on Craig's, is at any time during the year, you know, we do these all the time, at any time during the year, if you've got an idea, hey, I heard about this on our risk enterprise management system that we should add, that's when you bring it up to Scott or anybody in a committee. And Scott keeps track of all this, well, everybody does, as he showed under that. But that's, you can make revisions at any time. But this is just that we're checking the box.
Well, not to the policy, but to the enterprise risk management.
Yeah, to the policy.
Process.
If you got a good idea, you can try to implement it and get it in the policy, sure.
Okay.
I really value that.
Yeah, okay.
The ideas, and maybe we're not talking about the same things, but on your slide 6, when you talk about the directors are able to ask for additional information, or we think we've seen something and we haven't heard what OPPD's response is, it's very valuable to get that reinforcement, and that's how we're supposed to do it. So
Yeah, at any time throughout the year.
Yeah.
It's a real, thank you, Director Yoder. It's important to note too, I mean, obviously you're seeing the red risks. There's these multiple levels of risk, so there could be one of these risks that we're monitoring, discussing, it's regular, and it would be an opportunity to answer your question in that way. So thank you. And with regards to your question, I guess it does tee up the question, are there any desired changes to the policy or considerations at this time?
I don't hear any. So I think we're good to go on that.
Go.
So we'll close that. So we do have another, this is on me, but Scott, I need some help on this. So do I see Strategic Directive 1 is an action item on this, is that what I'm seeing here, Ken?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
there were revisions that were suggested.
Okay.
and submitted to the governance committee for consideration, and then
And-
we posted them for, well, between the board meetings, not
Yeah.
for 30
Happy
days.
to walk through this.
Yeah, Scott, why don't you? I think there's just a minor change, but this again can be discussion. Why don't you walk through that?
Sure.
Thanks.
This is really in follow-up to the meeting last month where we reviewed the proposed refinements to SD1. That did lead to a posting of the revised SD1 as the board had discussed for public comment. And as of yesterday, I do not believe that we had received any comment
No
on
comments.
proposed changes. So what's being presented here is the policy that was reviewed and discussed last month, those revisions, and the thought would be that it would move forward to consent agenda on Thursday for approval. And you have a copy here. The real changes were that we were adding core values to the policy. We are changing the word leverage OPPD's leadership to achieve these principles rather than goals. And of course, we were adding a colon to core values to keep it consistent. Are there any questions, or are we good to move this forward to Thursday?
It looks great. Can I just get a quick summary of what mechanisms and tools we use to solicit input? How did we let people know? Social media, the wire, what did that look like?
And it is in our press release, our monthly press release
Okay.
as well. And then even on the OPPD listens, and then we did do some social media on it as well.
Okay. Pretty, I mean, the same things we would do for any of the other ones. Okay, great.
Great. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay. So that will be on the regular agenda as well. I think that's all right.
For governance.
Your other items are all
The rest are all going to be in a closed session.
Okay, our next item is we have a presentation, and I'm going to throw it over to Tim to go ahead and tee it up.
Sure. As part of our integrated energy marketplace work, we have two more presentations that we'll be doing over the next 2 months. This one in June is really a presentation on non-traditional solutions. And what I'm going to do is turn it over to Troy Vai, who's kind of led this initiative, and all the pieces that the board has seen over the last year or so. And I'll let Troy kind of tee it up and introduce Brad, and then we'll have a presentation, some dialogue about kind of this component of our integrated energy marketplace strategic initiative. So, Troy.
Thank you. And as Tim said, we're here to provide an update of the sub-initiative that we call Non-Traditional Solutions, NTS. And it's just that. It's how do we look at new technologies in a different way, and how can we potentially integrate those into our system both now and in the future. And if you think about the technological landscape and how it's changing, it's really important for us to have a good foundational way of considering these technologies as we move forward. We did create the name ourselves. We did that on purpose because we wanted to make sure that there wasn't any preconceived notions when we started this initiative. If you think about smart grid and the connotations around that, if you asked 10 different people what a smart grid was, you'd probably get 10 different answers. So we wanted to make sure when we started this, we started at a level playing ground with no preconceived notions. And what this initiative really does is kind of sets the stage for how we'll plan going forward. How do we look at technologies? How do we think about them? How do we analyze them? And is less about a go build right now strategy. With that being said, after we went through this analysis and we started looking at technologies and how they could be applied to our system, and we looked at some of the planned near-term T&D type activities, there may be some applications that a non-traditional solution may work at a much cheaper cost than a traditional. So Brad will go into that a little more in a bit, but that's kind of an exciting point that we got out of this. And so what does this look like? If you think of batteries, different storage options, small distributed generation, solar, or combinations of those in lieu of a new transmission, new substation, the potential for that's pretty exciting. And to do that, though, you have to understand the economics behind them, kind of their operational characteristics and how they can be applied on your grid and how you can leverage and unlock all those different values. Truly, this helps us move to more of an integrated view of planning. Most utilities are still kind of planning separately. They've got generation resource planning and they have a transmission distribution. There's not a lot of conversation that go on between the two. And what this does is kind of link the two together. And if you think about options that can solve multiple issues or provide multiple values to you, many times those may be the optimal solutions. And so bringing those together is really important for us moving forward. At this time, I'd like the team to stand up so we can kind of recognize those and so you can see. These are some of the core folks. We had about 10 core and probably 30 or 40 across the organization that at some point in time kind of touched this. So a good cross-functional group. Brad Underwood, the director of Generation Resource Planning, kind of led the group. They did a fantastic job. The tenacity of this group was really impressive. So from day one, they had a room assigned. They had a schedule, and they marched along several mornings. You'd come in at 6:30 in the morning, and they were all in this room studying technology. So there was an excitement here that was really refreshing to see, and I can't tell you how proud I am of the way they performed as we've walked through this. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Brad to provide the update.
The question is this: when we go out and we send people out, I think it's important we still go to these meetings around the country and figure out what's going on. So I assume that's in the budget, that we have money to do that, correct? That you're all going to places and figuring out what's going on. I don't want to go back into a shell like I've seen some companies do, that we don't want to spend the money on that and then you don't know what's going on in the country. Well, that's a bad thing for a major energy company in Omaha. So I hope that's the case on the finance people that were
I'd say over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of folks head out to California and some of those areas to kind of learn. During this particular initiative, phone calls, researching data that was published, that was all heavily part of it. Talking to folks like Green Tech Media, so there was a lot of collaboration that took place during this initiative. But I think if you look at the organization as a whole, we do plan on continuing to learn, because that's how you learn, right?
Absolutely, yep. Yeah, and I know American Public Power Association is great, and I know we're actively engaged, but we're engaged in other things.
Absolutely.
Right, Tim?
I think our intent is, these are not one and done initiatives, very clearly. These are meant to be continually kind of updated and reviewed, and as changes occur in technology and pricing and cost and in integration experiences, we're going to make sure that we stay on top of those and that we implement those that are proven and will create value for customer owners. And so we'll still continue these teams in some format, in some way, as we kind of move forward. So.
Yeah, okay.
So every one of the IEM initiatives have plans to continue to make that part of the business going forward. So every one of them that we've done, we have implementation plans, we have owners, and we have support from the senior staff. So it does continue on in perpetuity.
Thank you.
Well, I was just hoping you could assign names to faces. Yeah.
Oh. How about we just go ahead and have them introduce themselves?
Great.
I'm Guy Lucy, Substation Engineering.
I'm Mike Herzog, Manager at Distribution Planning Department.
Dan Linehan, Director of System Planning here at OPPD.
Brad Underwood, Financial Planning and Analysis.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. So I'm pleased to bring the product that this team helped construct to you. I will say, too, just a small supplement to the very generous introductions that we received is that I think we would all agree that we kind of found a special place where your work and your hobbies kind of aligned. And I think that was really fun to kind of go through that. And we got to scratch all of our techie itches, and we got to scratch all of our feasibility itches and all those kind of fun things. So I think that was just personally really satisfying to go through that with the team. So I really appreciate the team's effort. As Troy mentioned, you can see on the slide here, non-traditional solutions. He talked a little bit about the origin of the name and why we constructed it this way. But ultimately, what we were really trying to do is create a structure in which all of these kind of technologies that utilities are trying to figure out how to embrace can be integrated, and all those value streams can be unlocked in a meaningful and objective way. And so that kind of brings us to the primary question is, can non-traditional solutions such as distributed generation, battery storage, and other items cost effectively defer or eliminate traditional transmission, distribution, and generation investments? And so as we look at these technologies, what we're trying to do is bring structure to the transmission value, the distribution value, the generation value, and any sort of other value streams that may be pertinent to the attributes of those technologies, and bring them together in a meaningful way to try and create the most optimal solution, and like the question says, to potentially avoid a traditional solution that we normally would have proceeded with. So I'm going to talk a lot about the process of what the team went through. And this is real quick, just kind of a setup slide, kind of going through the whole thing. The images at the bottom aren't necessarily for consumption, so I'm not asking you to read those. They're more sort of representative of what that stage is. But if you look at A there, so what is the scope of non-traditional solutions that we should consider? And that image down there that is not legible is what we call the technology universe. And so it was what all is out there that we can incorporate, that we need to identify, evaluate, and then consider within the process. And so those are all the technologies that we looked at, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. And the second phase is, how are other utilities deploying these grid scale solutions? And so what you see there is kind of a subset of our case studies. So there was, I think, about 11 or 12 that we actually did. I just threw 5 or 6 up there that I thought the room might recognize. But in addition to that, we also went out per challenge from the senior team when they chartered the initiative, was go out and talk to the customers. So it's good that you can see what the utilities are doing, but make sure that you're staying close to the customers and that you get their perspective and how they're viewing these sorts of things. And we take that under consideration as we work towards whatever the final product is. And then the last one, or the second to last, is how should OPPD evaluate and consider NTS going forward? And so the images there are actually of distribution circuit peaks. And so the point we're trying to convey here is that the type of granular information that's fed into the process, that's fed into the system. When does the circuit peak? When does it not peak? Does it coincide with system peak? Does it not coincide with system peak? And then at the bottom there, if you can maybe just see a little bit of coloring, those are the different sort of technology solutions that we're introducing to satisfy the demand, the energy demands of that circuit, to try and solve the problem of can we avoid the traditional distribution investments. And then the last one, you see the stair step here. What new capabilities and tools does OPPD need to be successful? Based on our current state and the things that we've constructed to use in the future, what are the gaps? What do we need to fill in? Either information, people, skill sets, communications, whatever it needs to be. What do we need to address to make sure we can do this into the future? So that's kind of the process laid out from the highest level. So going to kind of solutions in scope, we evaluated 34 different types of technologies, different types of resources, both from a customer, from a distributed sort of lens, as well as a utility scale lens. So as an example, solar is kind of an easy one. You have a utility solar kind of solution, and then you have customers on that circuit who may be willing to put on solar. And so the 34 kind of starts to fracture pretty quickly once you look at it from both a customer and a utility perspective. And in addition, within those 34, there's sort of one of the 34 that's kind of that EEDR, and then within that one, there's the 4,000 programs of EE and DR. Yes, Director McGuire. Yeah, thank you. I apologize for that. Energy efficiency and demand response. Yeah. So you kind of can see when you start kind of going in the middle of the technology options and then start going out, it gets pretty fractured pretty quick. And that was part of the challenge, is how do you create a structure that accounts for that. But these are the 6 that emerged relatively quickly as options to prioritize. And so the first one, you can see energy storage. That's primarily a lithium-ion discussion, and so it's a battery kind of play there, I suppose. There's other storage options that were identified. Those you might hear compressed air energy storage. You might hear pumped hydro. We identified those as having technical and geographic constraints. So those were removed. So you can kind of see a little bit of the methodology, how we went about doing things. Solar PV is using solar irradiance to generate electricity. Demand response utilizes programs and technologies to reduce electrical demand during peak times. This is kind of the shaving, if you've ever heard of that terminology. Energy efficiency is programs and technologies to consistently reduce electricity demand. So a common one is a light bulb. You put in a more efficient light bulb, it drops that energy demand consistently and not just at peak. And so we were looking at those suite of programs. Small generators consist of diesel and gas engines and would include both rental and purchase options. So if we don't need a sort of a portable thermal generator very long, we might look at renting that. And that may be better for our customer owners than just outright purchase. And then finally, microgrids. And this was probably a little bit of the more difficult technologies, I think. And so you can see on the slide, electrical infrastructure, which utilized advanced controls to increase redundancy. A lot of what we found with microgrids were critical facilities were after resiliency, or they were after redundancy, and they did that because that's what they wanted. So, and many of you would expect that. So it's a little bit of a kind of a narrow scope. It's fairly prescriptive. This is our objective and what we want to do, and so that's kind of what we saw within microgrids. But I'll give you a little flavor too of kind of how we narrowed the technology down. So there was technologies that were reviewed in the previous phase, energy efficiency and demand response. I think we gave an update on that about 6 months ago, if memory serves. Technical and geographic constraints, that's what I mentioned with pumped hydro and compressed air energy storage. Some of them had more economic alternatives. So you have a technology and there's just a better solution. So a quick example might be a flywheel or hydrogen, something with hydrogen, right? It's not necessarily what we would consider an optimal or an economic solution. And then some things we identified as sort of an emerging technology for future consideration. And so as an example of that might be home automation. Home automation looks like different things to different people, and there's not really a consistent and clear line of sight to what those things are and how they will impact a user's energy profile and how they'll impact a utility. And so we kind of said, hey, this is something we need to watch, but not something we can integrate right away into our tools. And so now that we've kind of scoped the technologies and a little bit of their attributes, here's some quick comments on the case studies. So we did find a number of examples where people had deployed these kinds of solutions. And what we found is that sort of the cost-beneficial non-traditional solutions tended to be low. They were sort of infrequent. They're not very well known. They're not very commonly used. And this is part of the challenge of being able to get them into your organization. Is a lot of these are to a certain extent in somewhat of their infancy or early adoption. Successful implementation focused on projects with unique applications or very high traditional solution costs. So I'll just give you a real quick example here. So APS, you see the image at the top there, Arizona Public Service. They were going to have to install some sub-transmission, some 21 kV sub-transmission. They were going to have to go 20 miles over rugged terrain. So if you're kind of familiar with APS's territory, you know, sort of mountainous, and there's a lot of preservation and conservation in that area of the country. And so you're going to build a 20-mile, 21 kV sub-transmission to shave 2% of the load. And I think the folks down there really made a thoughtful decision, and they said, wait a minute, we're going to spend X number of dollars to build this sub-transmission to save a very small fraction of load. Maybe there's a more thoughtful way we could do this. Maybe we could do it with some demand response, with some energy efficiency. And so that's what they did. But just as a little bit higher resolution into that kind of scene was it was location specific. There were examples of NTS projects that were driven by a desire for institutional learning that required subsidization or rate increase to customer. And so what we saw was with Ameren, they kind of had a proof of concept microgrid. And they did that in Illinois, and what they did is they partnered with S&C, which is a transmission and distribution equipment manufacturer, and they also included wind, solar, battery, and natural gas for generation. And so if you look at the totality of those solutions, it was 1.4 megawatts. So pretty small, pretty localized, and Ameren's objective, as we discovered through the case study, is, hey, can we stand this up? Can this be done? And then their long-term goal, the team's read, was that they wanted to provide that as part of their products and services offering down the future, into the future. Kind of that fourth bullet point, the deferral of projects can provide the utility the time it needs to verify the development of load to warrant the traditional solution. And so one of the things that we saw was some challenges regarding to load realization. And so a lot of times there were examples where they had kind of gone down the temporary solution to watch and make sure that the load came in. So the analogy would be, think about our high growth areas. Think about Sarpy County, maybe Northwest Omaha, where we have relatively healthy growth. We can build out all that infrastructure, and then something can turn, something can change, macroeconomic, regional, whatever the case may be. And we've built some infrastructure that's potentially underutilized in its early years. And so what these solutions allow you to do is kind of build some time where you can increase your certainty that that load is actually going to come in, and you build accordingly. And our folks had historically done that, but we think we've added maybe some sharper tools to be able to do that maybe a little bit better. And then the bottom one, as we looked at some of these technologies kind of incorporated by these other utilities, we identified that SPP planning procedures and policies don't explicitly address battery storage. And I think for us, that's certainly a problem. And so as we identified that, we went back and we looked at some FERC content that's been promulgated, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who governs markets. And FERC has passed a mandate back that says all the RTOs have to figure out how they want to value these assets and how they integrate into their planning procedures. And so not a lot of pursuit on that one specifically, because we saw FERC come in and kind of give everybody the clarity that we all needed, which is we need this resolved. But we did note that.
Brad, before you jump on.
Yeah.
First, thank you for going into detail on these. You're preemptively answering a lot of the questions that I had.
Sure.
But on the first one, I guess when I look at the word successful, I think that can take on a variety of different definitions. And I guess I'm kind of wondering how you and the team measured success. Was that really about a cost-benefit analysis, or was there what were some of the other factors that you used to say,
sure,
that case study that it was successful?
Yep. So what we looked at when we were using the term successful was the utility thought something was going to happen. Whether it was load growth or whatever it was, most of the times it was load growth. They deployed a solution to address that problem. And when they deployed the solution, it either worked or didn't work, meaning the load either came in or didn't come in, or the solution did or didn't do what we thought it was going to do. And then we also identified the cost beneficial component of that because we've been doing that consistently, and that's part of our strategic directives and that sort of thing. So I think your question is a great one. It is a little bit of a general term, but those are the types of things we were looking at.
That's helpful.
Did you do what you were trying to do?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect.
And then customer outreach. So we worked with kind of three groups of people. We talked to a local and some would argue regional engineering services firm, and we kind of said, hey, here's what we're looking at. What are you guys seeing with these non-traditional solutions? What can you share with us? What should we be collaborating on? And they shared with us that their customers do show an interest, but it doesn't really go much further than in the interest. So they'll come in and they'll say, hey, what about this or what about that? And they'll have sort of this technological and sort of operational discussion on what that does or doesn't do. And then they kind of characterize it. It doesn't go too terribly deep beyond that. The other thing that they shared with us is that a lot of what they were doing was energy monitoring. So they would engage with a customer, go in and look at their operations, and they would recommend maybe some peak shaving, or just give them better visibility to their electrical demand as a total in an effort to better manage their utility bill. And one thing that they told us clearly was that the decision that their customers were making, whether to proceed or not proceed with these kinds of solutions, were economically based. They said there's really no ifs, ands, ors about it. That's where the customer is coming from our perspective as the engineering services firm. The commercial developer, this was probably the most interesting discussion, at least for me personally. But the commercial developer, they're involved in an $80 million university expansion in the United States. And so one thing that they shared with us is that when the developer bids on a project, a lot of their owners are looking for lowest net present value cost over the 30 years. And so they said to be competitive, to win work, really what we focus on. So we'll design a solution based on their specifications, and then we drive that cost as low as we possibly can, not just the construction cost, the cost of operating the facility over 30 years. And that gives us the strongest bid, they thought. And they shared with us that economics still are the primary driver for all energy infrastructure decisions. And sort of the not so subtle undertone of that was when they said economics are still the primary driver. We don't put these things in because for the most part it doesn't lower long-term NPV. So there may be some energy efficiency things that they may recommend, and maybe it's a lead decision or something like that. But what they shared with us is that it's a bid competitiveness thing from the developer perspective.
Operating costs. If you're looking over a 30-year net present value, if you're making that application, that seems like an awful long time.
Yeah.
given technology changes always. Is that the proper amount of time to evaluate that, or should it be 20, or
Yeah.
depends on the business, I suppose?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that question. I guess the analogy sort of I would make in my mind is sort of your, sort of like your mortgage. You sign up to this big commitment, and you got to go 20 years or 30 years or whatever your term is, and you want the lowest cost. And so that's kind of the perspective. But are the assets, are these technologies going to change over that 30 years? Yeah, absolutely. And that's the difficulty, I think, with making these kind of decisions.
And I think what's really important with this one, we're not the one who said 30-year net present value. It was the commercial developers that said that as they kind of go in, recognizing there will be changes. I mean, actually, we go through and make changes to businesses that build after year 1 and year 2 on some of the Eco 24/7 stuff and significantly save them dollars and create comfort and value, even in a new building. So it can go that fast. And but that was an interesting perspective from the commercial developers.
And so kind of that last data point there, the residential builders. This was actually a monthly meeting of the Metro Omaha Builders Association. So we were really excited as a team that we got to touch, I think 32 builders that were there at one time. Instead of going to talk to 1 or 2 builders, it was just super efficient. Got to kind of witness their monthly meetings, but they kind of some similar sentiment from the engineering services providers in that the customers are sort of interested. They kind of like the stuff, but there just seems to be little interest that materializes as far as decision making and what they incorporate in their homes. They also shared a perspective with us that from their standpoint, EVs would be adopted first, and then it would be a solar and storage solution. And so we kind of took that under consideration. As a quick side note, we actually had team members from the EV team and the distributed energy resources team actually go with us. So we were all out there to discuss with those folks. From the builder's perspective, kind of last thought, they said they were going to continually monitor the price points for changes to user adoption and kind of their building model impacts, kind of how they go through their business. But it's good to get that affirmation from them.
For example, a couple questions. One is, so this is a snapshot in time, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a sense for the extent to which any of these particular stakeholders, what their perspective has, how that's evolved over time, nor what it will be 5 or 10 years from now.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other question is, it seems completely accurate to me to suggest, especially in the commercial development world, that economics are still the primary driver.
Mm-hmm.
I think the third bullet under engineering is a little bit too all-inclusive, which is to say decisions are economically driven. I think there's more at play there.
Okay.
I think there are plenty of organizations in town who are setting pretty robust goals related to net zero energy efficiency,
Sure.
climate neutrality goals that are driving different decisions. They're evaluating how to do those things economically, but economics isn't the only driver anymore. At least not in terms of some of the people that I'm talking to. So
Sure.
I again, it's just sort of on that continuum, and with respect to where it was and where it's going, I think there's the interest in adopting NTS is growing, and it's not strictly leveraged or hanging on whether or not it's an economic decision anymore.
Yeah.
It's still the driver, still the primary driver, but I don't think it's only that anymore.
Yep. I thank you for those comments, and I think we see a lot of that kind of with our larger industrials, and we see those kind of aspirations. So we certainly acknowledge that they do exist, and want to stay away from absolute statements.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
but
you.
I think what's really important, this is really consistent in some respects on what we see and other customer research we see in a broad macro, right?
Sure.
We have customers today that are making decisions that are based on their own core values or internal strategic focus. They may be making decisions on renewable resources not from a cost-benefit perspective, but from a recruitment perspective,
Sure.
very clearly, right? So there are other mission elements that are outside of that, but in the broad macro, this is consistent what we've seen even historically. You know, it still has to be somewhat of a cost-benefit. Certainly not too high to restrict them.
Right.
But I think your point is well taken, Director Moody, in that, you know, this continuum is changing, there's no doubt. You know, what the team has seen is some of the changes we've seen from 2015, 16, 17, and 18 on ERI and the number of companies. It's Energy Resource Institute that really has more companies driving strategic focus around net neutrality, energy neutrality, 100% non-carbon. I mean, there's a variety of changes that are going on corporately, and we certainly see that. We see that trend developing. How that drives down to the local facility or to the local business somewhat changes in how they look at it and how they do that. So, but that's obviously a piece that we see, but that has been consistent on the cost, and maybe it's the Midwestern piece in some respect.
Yeah.
But obviously we'll, over the period of time, we'll measure that continuum and how fast and how quick it moves.
Well, so good point. The other thing that I would add is that, you know, our mission is about providing energy services, right? And this perfectly aligns with that. And as we have an increasing number of customers who, for whatever reason, set net zero goals or whatever those are going to be, part of what we can do as an energy services company is look to them and say, how can we help you achieve what you want to do, right? And to do so
you bet.
in a cost-effective manner.
No, I will remind people. Great points. Something very, very important for these initiatives, or at least this sub-initiative on MTS, is to what extent these new technologies are helping us avoid construction of distribution, transmission, or generation. So that's the reason why we've confined the work of this group to that. In addition to the points that you're making are really, really important, but I don't think they're within the scope of these. Can these new technologies offset new distribution, transmission, or generation build? That's just a reminder of.
Fair enough. So go ahead.
On that reminder, can we add a layer or another attribute? These new technologies also allow us to better integrate the new generation that we have, the renewables. I mean, these are the technology, storage, and all of these things.
Quick ramp
allow us to better integrate the variability and the problems that we have with renewables. So
and therefore, it avoids new installation of new generation.
That would otherwise have to.
So ultimately, it goes to that same. We put a lot of time and thought into scoping these.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder.
But it does have this kind of opportunity. So as we begin to see changes in this, the work we do on Eco24, the work we do on some of our energy efficiency, demand response kind of activities is really to that point, is to help customers become more efficient, whether it's through more efficient heating, cooling, building technologies, lighting, optimization of their current facility. We do a significant amount of that work today. I think as we begin to experience these, you will also hear next month on our distributed energy resource piece is that we don't want folks to get between us and our end-use customers, which means we will be playing a role in that space very clearly. If it's a customer's desire to move that, for us to use and leverage our knowledge and capabilities to provide those services, I think you'll see that next month as Tim McAreevy comes and presents the outcome of that strategic initiative work that we're doing, and the work that we've done before about other commercial and industrial product and service development and services that we'll provide very clearly.
Hey,
so
when you say you don't want to get somebody in between you and the customer, being a monopoly is what we are. But there's a certain point, all these things sound good, but as you just said, many of them don't make any financial sense. When you decide to get into between the customer and well, there's going to be some things that don't work or don't make money. I agree with Craig. More people are looking into this, but some things just aren't gonna fly. So how are you gonna maybe wait till next month?
No,
How do
think
we not get into the wrong business is what I'm saying.
Well, I'm not even sure
Maybe
we're in the
shouldn't be in
business.
all these businesses.
The example that I've shared, I know with all the board members, is that we're doing some work with different commercial customers on solar installations in their facilities. And so part of the conversation around that is it may be a higher cost for them to do that, but they want to do it.
Yeah.
And so we are going to be engaging in that relationship and optimizing how we can leverage our bidding process, general contracting process, the work that we do in Eco24, and provide that service to customers. If they want to pay that incremental price, or they want that kind of service, or they want a microgrid or additional redundancy, they're the ones making that choice. We're just making sure we're leveraging our capabilities to provide that service to customers at the cost of the customer. The customer will pay for those costs,
that's good.
not to spread those costs to other customers, but very clearly have them pay for that kind of service that they want.
Yeah, and that's right.
Yep.
So no one's subsidizing.
Correct.
That's
the
my
intent.
desire to do whatever, and not that that's bad. That's
I think you'll
that's
see
a good
next
thing.
month when we bring DER here that there was a lot of thought as far as resourcing. So for instance, if there's something that we don't have that many customers that have interest in, you wouldn't hire 20 people to run a department that has no rate of return unless those customers were willing to pay that.
Right.
So next month is really focused on that customer side. This is more the system.
Cool.
And so just to be clear, there's those two stepping points. But resources are something we have to consider as an organization. How heavy do you go into something that may not be there yet? And are there ways to set yourself up so that you have access? Like, you know, we have, for some of our large customers, we have third parties we utilize if they want to have something done at their facility, and maybe there's some steps there. So just to be clear, we've got a clear separation here between the system now and customer next month when the ER comes in.
I think we've got some options here, maybe towards the end of the presentation, that are sort of competitive that we'd like to share with you. So we're coming away with something, I suppose, is what I'm saying. But,
Well, I think this is extremely important because you're proactively monitoring technologies and solutions. And I agree with Tim, they may not be economically viable yet, but yet is the operative word there. It's coming. Batteries are certainly coming. A lot of this is coming. And so I think it's great that we're proactively watching it and investing in it with our time and thinking. And I think it's going to be impactful down the road. Some of it's going to be disruptive, but I'd rather know about it and see it coming than wait till it slaps us.
Exactly.
So I think this is really important stuff.
At the same time,
Yeah.
there's another whole industry that's being formed, and I'm giving Craig an example of energy solutions, that there are new companies being formed that are offering services to people that we might not be ready to offer that yet, that they're already offering those services for those people who are interested in it. So, I don't know if you want to add to that, Craig, but there's, we might not be able to do that on a whole utility scale. We're not going to hire those extra 20 people, but there's a lot of other people and another whole sub-industry there of energy solutions people who are willing to take that risk and able to find those customers who are interested in that.
Yeah, and that's their niche, and
And
that's what
that's
they
a
should be
niche.
doing. You can't be
Yeah.
in everything, is what I'm saying.
Right.
So, sorry, Brad, I got one more
That's
question.
all right.
So, Mark brought up the idea too. Some of these things are gonna, at some point, work out. And I make this real simple. On the battery storage, earlier we talked about risk to the company, or gee, if this comes, this is gonna be affected.
ERM risk.
Yeah. Are you gonna, on that, how do you look at that?
Yeah, so there are some operational items that we looked at, and actually that's
If you go in
honestly
there.
a great transition
Okay,
into my
that's all I wondered if
my
you
next
could
slide
discuss
here.
it.
But so real quick on the right here, you can see kind of that's the center mass of that lower left image that I started with in the beginning that you couldn't read. But here's kind of those technologies, and you can see how they're integrating. But I want to give you an idea of the level of detail of the tools that we build and kind of the information requirements that go into this. So the tools that we have requires 91 inputs for the 6 technologies. Very, very specific, dollar per kilowatt, whatever we had to put in to get the full value stream from these these assets or these behaviors, 91 inputs that need to be monitored and managed, that we built an infrastructure to prescribe how that should occur. There are a number of quantitative and qualitative value streams, and please don't write these because they're probably going to come quick, but I just want to give you a flavor. There's a value with T&D deferral, generation capacity, SPP fee reductions, avoided energy, line loss, arbitrage, ancillary services. There's also values with customer satisfaction, community benefit, environmental. There's a value that needs to be considered with project risk and innovation. So if that kind of tells you a little bit of how we're looking at these things, those are some of the value streams that we're trying to capture and credit accordingly based on the attributes of the solution. To your question, Director Gay, so there was also an operational review that we'll get into, but there's technical limitations, operational impacts, and reliability and resiliency concerns. And that was part of our internal stakeholder process that we did within the organization, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. Here's kind of an image that brings a little bit more resolution to the tools and the process. So I just kind of want to walk through this with everybody left to right. But you can see the first step is that high potential project identification. So annually what we do internally is Mike and Dan have a list of T&D projects that need work for resiliency, for reliability, for degradation, whatever the issue is. They have this basket of projects over the 5-year period. And for the year that we were looking at, this year, for the 5-year, there was 101 projects that were sort of in that population. And so that's just a byproduct of our annual planning process. But we wanted to look at those projects in that basket in light of NTS. And so some of the things that we considered to identify good project candidates were project rationale. So is the load forecast exceeding the existing infrastructure that's in place? Is there growth that we need to serve with incremental infrastructure? Project cost. So we need a certain amount of sufficiently high project costs to work into this. So in other words, if some of these projects are $45,000, $30,000, $20,000, not a great candidate for these types of solutions for the most part, just as a general statement. So that's project rationale and project cost. The third one is project lead time. So if your ramp is pretty violent or pretty quick, you can't get this stuff in place, depending on what you want to do. And so we had to take in project lead time into consideration. The megawatt peak shave requirement was also used to filter projects. So if you recall the brief example I gave about APS, they were looking for 2% of that load on the sub-transmission. So we're looking for megawatts that are achievable to shave or avoid, whatever the solution may be, or serve with these assets on the distribution system. So it's got to be reasonable. You got to be able to capture it. And then the load growth rate, and this is really a certainty statement. So how certain are we that this load growth is going to come? So the example is if you've got a list of 5 years of projects, and you see a project in year 4 that is there because of load growth, your certainty now is less. Then it'll be in year 3, and then it'll be in year 2. And so as you approach that, your certainty grows, and at the same time, you need to consider the lead time that I've got to have to deploy these types of solutions. The types of screens that we kind of went through for the original batch of 101 projects. And then kind of that second one was the technology solution and valuation. And this is where really our tools that we constructed came into place. So you can see there, hopefully in that top bullet point, there's load growth consideration, load shapes, limiting equipment, customer composition. So what do these things look like, and what needs to be considered here in this phase? And that was the first phase of kind of where we tested the economics as well. And then as we got through to the third silo, for lack of a better term, or the third screen, what we did is we said, hey, for these projects that are really starting to pick up momentum and we're getting excited about as a team, let's go back in and there's 4, 5, or 6 primary inputs, whatever those may be, that really move the needle on the evaluation. And let's go in and validate that those are actually correct. And so we went in and we went through that validation, and there was a little bit of refinement. We were in the hunt, sort of generally speaking, but we did make tweaks kind of in that third step. And then the fourth step is the qualitative and operational assessment. And this is where I made the comment earlier where we kind of did some internal stakeholder stuff. But for these 3 projects that we identified as high potential, we went down to ECC, to distribution operations, and we talked about it with them. And we said, here's what we're seeing. Here's the solution that we'd like to proceed. What do you guys think about this? And for the people pushing the buttons and pulling the levers on the distribution system, really operating that thing, we wanted to get their feedback on what it would take to do what we were suggesting might be done. And it was less of, had like your opinion on this. It was more of, what will it take to get this done? And so while we did a lot of opinion sort of shopping, for lack of a better term, this is where it sort of crystallized to the point where we had pretty good confidence that this was a solution that we should certainly evaluate deploying. So we went down and had consideration with those folks, and those were very productive discussions. I will say that the 3 projects that got through the sort of programmatic screening, we're high-cost projects that are kind of in high-growth areas of the service territory. So it's kind of that Westo, Northwest Omaha, Sarpy County kind of area where you've got a lot of development going in, and that local distribution infrastructure really needs some work and some equipment. And so that's where those projects were identified at. Those projects have a reasonable amount of lead time, something in the neighborhood of approximately 3+ years. And so that's kind of that tension I was describing earlier, where you've got to get that sort of confidence in your load ascension or your load ramp, and still leave yourself enough lead time to react. So they're really good kind of 3-year projects that we see out in the future, and we want to continue to monitor those, both for the load realization, but also for the costs of the proposed solutions that we were recommending.
Brad, before you leave that
Yeah.
slide, what this tells me, I'm glad you're using filters and being thoughtful about your funnel, but there's 97 or 98 ideas that didn't make it.
Yep.
And if size was the reason for a lot of them, which I suspect it was, don't underestimate the value of the cumulative benefit of doing a whole bunch of smaller things. It's a lot like you learn in Lean, that it's 1,000 small decisions that add up to great improvements, that there aren't silver bullets in life typically.
Okay.
And what you've done is you found 3 silver bullets, but you might be missing 97 opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as it doesn't absorb too much management time and effort,
Yeah.
if they're still worthwhile, I'd have a sub-team go back and say, how can we knock off some of these good ideas and make these improvements? Because I think we'll see it's much lower risk profile than big projects.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind.
Okay. Thank you. So kind of moving on into our outputs. One of the things that we walked away from this thing with was a standardized and consistent cross-functional methodology. And when Mrs. Fisher was going through her sort of images of the dry casks and the pad, and you saw the 30 inches of the bottom of the cask of concrete that's plowed full of rebar, and you just know it's solid. And the analogy in my simple mind is that's what these tools equip us to do. It builds that pad to where as the technologies change, we can update the inputs, we can rerun the energy profiles on the distribution circuits, and we can relook at these things with ease and with confidence. And we'll continue to revise the tools as appropriate, but it really lays that solid base that was constructed by a cross-functional team with many different perspectives. And so that was a big win that we came out of this with. We also got clarity to resource and capability gaps that needed to be closed. And so I'll talk about a big one here on the next slide. But within the implementation plan, and that's kind of jumping, sorry, on the fourth bullet point there. Within the implementation plan, there are something like 36 activities that address the resources and the capability gaps and who's going to close them, and to a certain extent how they're going to close them, but there's enough latitude there where the business units and the functions can deploy the expertise they need to close them. But just to give you a flavor, that implementation plan goes through November of 20. So it's not a quick, as you're all very familiar with strategy implementation, it's not necessarily a couple of weeks worth of work. So some of these things are going to take some lead time, and I'll give you a quick example or some examples. So we need to outline the risk mitigation strategies for NTS deployment. So as we start putting generation on the distribution system, whether it be a battery, whether it be solar, whether it be thermal, portable gas units, that introduces a new set of risks. And we need to identify how we're going to manage that and protect the system and derive the value.
Can I add something there too? It's not just the risk, it's the complexity. So if you think about back to having 50 small projects, if I have 50 small batteries at different locations with circuits that all peak at different times, think about the operators that are sitting in the chair, and how do you have something in place that helps you not add so much complexity that you're missing the entire system, but is still optimal. And that's something that we've kind of struggled with as we walk through this, because a bunch of these little tiny ones with the automation that's in place right now is really tricky. And so that's why we kind of went to these larger scale where you have a handful of them that you can use.
Well, they all have to dovetail.
Troy, excuse me. People who are listening, I think can't hear, and that was a very good point. So maybe you should repeat that at a mic.
It's all yours.
Sorry about that. I was just pointing out the additional complexities that come with a lot of small distributed pieces of equipment on the system. So if you think about the operators that are in the system that are doing the switching, if you have normal transmission distribution, I don't want to say it's simple, but there's a lot less pieces and parts. If you start adding 50 batteries on the system with circuits that peak all at different times, and managing when do you charge those batteries, when do you deploy those batteries, along with all the other switching, some of the automation of that is still kind of in its early stages. Over time, it'll get a lot better. If you think of companies like Hawaiian Electric, who has a lot of solar, a lot of distributed, they've had to invest a lot of funds into new resources, new technologies to help them manage what they have. And I just want to, sometimes we forget about that operational complexity that comes with all these little small pieces and parts. And that's kind of why you saw us really focusing on the bigger stuff to start with. I think someday down the road when all that technology lines up and you have those communications and you have computers that decide when it charges and when it deploys, that'll make things a lot easier from a system operation standpoint. So I just didn't want to lose the sight of that.
Thank you.
So a couple other items real quick in the implementation plan: circuit level demand response. So we have demand response now that's system-wide that you are very familiar with, whether it be CoolSmart or Nest. And the idea here is how do we do that at a system level? And I'm sorry, thank you, circuit level. And if the circuit's different than the system, do we need to be able to hit that more times? And if we have to hit that more times, is there some sort of compensation thing? So these are the sort of things that we have to work through to make sure that we can do these things effectively and consistently and on a sustainable manner. New dispatch platform, that's a big one. So I think if I understood your point correctly, Director Yoder, there's a very specific way that you can value things like batteries and things like reciprocating engines from a fast ramp perspective within the environment of a growing concentration of renewables. And so we do a lot of that with the balancing authority, with SPP now, but there's values there that we need to consider as far as those technologies. And so that sub-hourly dispatch thing, that is a big thing for us, especially from the utility scale supply side, to be able to properly value those types of assets. And then real quick, I want to jump back up to 3, just so we leave this point with clarity. The 3 projects that we did identify require additional evaluation and will be monitored into the future. So these are the types of things that we're watching for: the load realization, the ability to do a circuit level demand response. So all of these things we've got to watch, and some things we've got to stand up to make sure that we can deploy these kind of solutions in these specific locations. And then, of course, we have a clear structure to embed this into our annual planning process. Director,
couple questions.
Yep.
One is, thank you. We specifically call out transmission and distribution here and don't talk about generation.
Yep.
And I wanted to just make sure that that was intentional, that we're setting generation sort of aside.
Yeah. So thank you for allowing me to clarify. I'm going to kind of tie Javier's comments back. So the original goal was to, how do we evaluate these technologies in light of avoiding traditional transmission and distribution investments? At the same time, there is a generation value with the avoidance of the T&D. So a quick example is energy efficiency or demand response. There's a market value of energy. There's a value of capacity. And so those types of things are generally considered in that generation bucket, but they have a place at this table because there's a value that we can avoid, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. And then just a real kind of quick question on the 101 projects, and we don't need to get into details, but I guess I'm wondering where you drew that line between non-traditional solutions and things that we know about, have considered, and have sort of set aside for one reason or another. And I'll use, Mr. Corbin's in the room, OPPD.
Yep.
You know, that's something that we're familiar with. We've seen it deployed in other places. Those programs that are intended to reduce demand response, or intended to reduce demand in other ways. I'm just kind of, can you help me understand sort of where we drew that line between things that are, you know, what is non-traditional
Right.
and what's not?
Right. That's a great question. As I understand OPPD, and I'm not a subject.
Just using that as a random example. Yeah.
So you won't hear much from me on OPPD, but as an example with OPPD, I believe, and there may be other thoughts in the room, that the organization thinks there are maybe more efficient or more economic ways to achieve energy efficiency or demand response, or whatever it is OPPD is trying to do.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of one of the criterias that I kind of tried to mention earlier that didn't get on a slide, which is, are there better ways to do that? So the rudimentary analogy is like flywheels and hydrogen. Okay, those are great to do those specific things, but there are better ways to do those types of things. And so that was kind of the process that we would go through in consideration of all the technologies.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I would say this, and this is less of an O-Power, but in some of the customer experience pieces, what we're seeing pop up there is this energy information and energy knowledge. And so part of our customer experience work has been, how do we begin to demonstrate that without using a relatively high cost O-Power to be able to do that and yet get the value and the benefit from it. A couple early things that we've seen with O-Power, and I know someone will disagree with me on this, but when you talk to the utility versus when you talk to the provider of O-Power, is that you can't sustain, there's not a sustaining ability of some of that O-Power related work. That's why you look at other technological changes, whether it's DR or other energy efficiency kinds of activity. We think in our customer experience plan, we have some concepts and ideas that we'll be kind of executing as we kind of get that technology foundation prepared for us to kind of move forward on, that would create some of that value. Around energy management, energy efficiency, energy use, comparative to neighbors, regions, customers, whatever that may look like. So,
thank you.
Absolutely.
The one other piece I want to add to it, back to the comment on generation, is understanding all those stacked benefits will also filter into the normal generation planning process. Where before we had a model, we stuck stuff in, and it spit out what your best option is. This really enhances that, and so a lot of these other benefits weren't necessarily identified or considered in the historic modeling process we had as an organization. This will bring that in. And so like a battery may have in the past, when you modeled it, only had this much value. It'll have more because you can leverage these other pieces and parts.
Sure, okay. Good clarification, thank you.
Okay, so real quick, this is my last slide. So next steps, we want to turn this on in the 2019 planning process. And so what that practically means is some of those projects in the 5-year plan will change. They'll be updated. There'll be new projects. Some projects will fall off. So we want to grab that population and reevaluate them through the lens of the program here. The sub-hourly dispatch platform, we've been working on that. We've made some good progress on that. We're kind of in the sourcing phase, so I'll sort of leave it at that. But good start on that. And then one of the things the senior team kind of challenged us with when we presented the findings was that when it's close, we would have a bias for inclusion. And so sort of the practical perspective that I took, if something's a $30,000 loser, does that mean you walk away from that solution? Well, maybe not. Maybe there are other qualitative considerations that need to be evaluated where the organization would decide, okay, we want to move forward with this. And so we didn't draw a clear line. If it's not above 0, we're not going to do it. So we didn't do that. We tried to build a process that allowed the users of the process to exercise their judgment, that when they're running through these things, they can take the whole picture in mind and consider the project at the end in light of all the circumstances. So bias for inclusion. And so that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I really appreciate that last comment. That's great because, to your point earlier, the scope of this was really about can we address the traditional solutions in a better way? But having those kind of the qualitative factors and allowing that to play in, we've got a suite of strategic directives, and that should be sort of the triangulation that you do when you get to these points where it's kind of close. You let some of those other factors play in. So I appreciate that comment. That's great.
I think what you'll see is as we identify, we move those 3 through the process with additional evaluation and work that they're going to do. We'll bring back the ones where we use in this example to share with you what we're going to do, what we believe it will solve, and then come back around and say, did it solve what we said it was going to solve? How did it operate? How did it perform? What are the complexities that we were able to address? What did that look like? And to become transparent on these items that we will begin to pilot and test and then ultimately make part of our kind of organizational strategy. So
on your last goal, Brad,
yes, sir.
Talk about economics. I know some forward-leaning companies like Facebook and others utilize but do not publish an internal cost of carbon. Is that something that OPPD has? And do you run them with and without?
So I'll address the first part first. So whether or not some customers have internal models, they have not shared those with me, and so that certainly that may or may not be true. You don't have visibility for that. I would say, do we have a value of the cost of carbon, which I believe is your question. We understand it has a value. We don't have any clear and concise way to put a dollar per CO2 like we would have, say, in a clean power plant environment or something like that, where it would be uniformly sort of enforced and there would be clear line of sight to values and those sorts of things. So it does have a value. It's a little bit difficult to tie it down and to build alignment around that value.
So in your response, are you suggesting that what's lacking is a methodology that you would accept, or just saying that because it's hard? we choose not to do it, or?
I think what we will see in the future is what that cost of carbon may look like with future regulation and changes, maybe even within SPP and how they may look at that. I think our point today is we don't have a cost of carbon in any calculation that we do today and what that may look like.
Which is my question.
Yep. So.
Okay. So Director Mines, I promised Director Mines that I would be going through each and every slide, so I don't want to let you feel like I've let you down. So back to the setup, you know, and our question, and kind of the back and forth we had here on the framework that I would have for this is these are great solutions for integrating renewables. You know, this is what we have to do. Another solution besides the two that I see showing up here, and that is steering use to when there is generation or reducing the use that we have, so demand side or energy efficiency.
Sure.
But the other opportunity for making wind more useful more of the time is more transmission. And I have heard from the Penn State that that is probably the least cost of all of these. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, and we got some transmission planning expertise in the room. There may be a thought there, but I would say from my perspective, yes, absolutely. And ultimately, the way I would translate the statement is that when you have a higher concentration of intermittent assets, one of the risk mitigation tactics is resiliency with energy delivery. And if you can get more energy delivery from and to different places, ultimately, yeah, there's absolutely a value for that. I think the cost of the transmission fluctuates. I think it looks different in different areas, and I guess sort of off the top of my head, I would draw on the analogy of APS. So for APS to build a sub-transmission...
Remind me what APS
I'm sorry,
is.
thank you, Arizona Public Service.
Thank you.
For them to build sub-transmission, you know, over some rugged terrain, that's probably going to be more expensive than it may be for us. And so those are the types of things I would think about when I hear that statement. But yeah, I would agree with that transmission is a great solution with a higher concentration of renewables.
And just real quick, I think the other piece of this is really there's the broad macro piece, is that our renewals today, the wind, is outside of our service territory. So there's also the resiliency within our footprint very clearly that we want to be able to maintain. And some of that today we have is through, you know, Sarpy County and Cass County, that's very close to our kind of large market footprint that also creates a value and some resiliency within that. And so you kind of begin to balance all of those. So to put battery storage out in, let's say, as an example, out near O'Neill, where Grand Prairie is, may not be the best use of battery storage, right? Sure. So to Brad's point, you want to probably bring it closer to the load centers, whether that's in North Region, South Region, Metro Region. And so that's the balancing that the planning folks will do over a period of time to find the right solution, what we need to do.
Also remember back to that comment earlier about hitting multiple problems at the same time.
Right.
You know, makes a lot of sense from an economic and from an operational standpoint. And kind of back to the renewable piece, anytime we go out and we grab more wind, we grab more generation, whatever the source is, we go through a study with SPP, and they make sure it's deliverable to our service territory. So that happens each and every time we go out for wind. They make sure that there's capacity available to get that from the source to our sink. There are some third parties out there right now who are looking at DC lines and some other mechanisms to move renewables for a long distance. There's a lot of studies going on nationally on what that might look like. But anytime you build transmission, just like anything else, there's the environmental piece. Are you in the line of a migrating bird, or is there a certain, you know, bug that you're going to disturb as you add your poles? I mean, there's a lot of other pieces that go into that.
Some non-economic factors.
Some. Absolutely. Well, they become economic at some point, right?
Let alone customers, right?
Yeah. You have to do remediation.
Very expensive.
Some anti-economic factors.
Yeah. Thank you. So on your bullet on slide 4 on the microgrids are for redundancy. Do they not also help provide some demand response?
Yeah, they could provide demand response. I guess within the context that we looked at, the demand response value is highly location specific. So if you have an area of the distribution system that's distressed or has less margin, the value of that demand response may be different than the value of demand response over here where there's tons of capacity, and if that makes sense.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
So the next slide at the top bullet, when you talk about, and Director Moody talked about this a little bit and mentioned the spectrum, and what I wanted to get to on your top bullet especially was this concept and the model of diffusion of innovations and how we would expect for new technologies and innovative technology that there would be a low number up front.
Sure.
And so I guess I'm still haunted by the words of someone a couple of years ago who said that OPPD wasn't interested in electric vehicles because there was zero penetration in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, if I love this team and I love this work because you're trying to look for how that innovation is happening. So I just want you to comfort me by telling me that you know about, you know, this innovative, the curve of the diffusion of innovations, and that you're cognizant of it, and you recognize that the cost benefit today in a report for something that happened last year or the year before is not the same set of numbers or what you would expect to see perhaps rapidly in the coming up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and you know, I think it gets a little bit back to the comment I made to Director Moody is probably want to stay away from absolute statements. And when we make that statement in the top left, I think one of the ways to think about it is like if you were to go out and say, I want to look at how people build combustion turbines. Tons of examples, just a unbelievable plethora of lessons learned, and it's super refined, and there's a best practice, and not the case here. And so it's less a statement on validity or, you know, merits or anything like that, and more a statement on there's just not a lot of stuff to go out and, you know, draw definitive conclusions from. And so I appreciate your perspective.
Right, I thank you, and I'm comforted. So the last bullet, I do appreciate you bringing up the FERC comments on that last bullet there, on the battery storage, and I think that's valuable. And just it's nice to have a little throwaway fact that the cost of using lithium-ion battery technology is less than 1/4 of what it was at the start of the decade. So, which is only to intensify the discussion we just had at the top, and how important your work is. So, and Director Trinan talked about that as well. I think that's all I had. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Oh, I was going to tell Mick I'm sorry I didn't go through every slide.
You know, I was trying to figure out how many SDs this covered. It covered quite a few. Because if you see everybody in this entire thing,
correct. I think it's
everybody, almost everybody.
There's like 6 or 7 SDs in there from.
It's quite a few.
I mean, very clearly. And the team in their original scope document would show some of that, of the SD implications.
Such a broad scope, which is really a holistic view that we need for this company.
And I think the work we're doing on the integrated energy marketplace are right. We'll probably come back and do kind of an annual update on some of the things that we're doing and what we're doing that, and think about how we do that. So.
Okay, should we go back into governance?
Great
Tim?
presentation.
Yep, back in governance.
You know what, I have one thing to mention. In the Omaha World Herald today, there was a great article on a pilot program that was sponsored by the Nebraska Environmental Trust. They were the funding source, and OPPD was the administrative source. they are giving $4,000 away to the first 50 customers to buy an electric vehicle, and $500 for a charging station. So if that piques anybody's interest out there in internet land or at this table, there's money to be had to get an electric vehicle. Right now, according to the Omaha World Herald, Nebraska has 1.7 million registered vehicles, and 600 plus or minus are electric vehicles. So 2 of them are sitting in the garage, maybe 3 of them in the basement. So that's about it. I hope we get more. Thank you.
Very good, thanks.
We had a great presentation on that last
Yeah, I missed that, yeah.
Well, you can get it.
That was awesome.
So, and that's available throughout the service territory?
Yep.
Douglas
Yeah,
County.
cool.
Douglas County.
Douglas County.
Oh, Douglas County.
Remember, we talked about that last month, is Douglas County, because that's where the greatest carbon emissions are.
Oh, and my,
yeah. The charger rebate is throughout the service territory.
Thank you.
The vehicle rebate specific to the Nebraska Environmental Trust is just available in Douglas County.
So, yeah, the counterpoint to that, of course, is that the commute distances in Douglas County are probably a little shorter than they are from Sarpy down to Johnson.
But the Nissan rebate is available to all.
Pardon?
Is the Nissan rebate is available to all?
The Nissan rebate is available throughout.
Exactly, which is another
That's
$3,000.
So it was the Nebraska Environmental Trust designation for Douglas County.
All right.
Are there any federal rebates or tax credits?
There are tax credits.
$7,500 still, up to $7,500.
Until they sell enough of the cars.
Yeah, until they hit like a 200,000 limit or something, so.
But please consult with your tax consultant. We're not providing that.
You personally.
Let's take a bio break for.
Okay, we're back into governance committee now. Tim, you want to make a motion to?
All right.
This is executive session.
I make a motion the board go into closed session at this time, 10:25 a.m. For discussion regarding enterprise risk management issues and corporate officers' performance reviews of President and CEO Timothy J. Burke, Vice President and CFO Javier Fernandez, Vice President Customer Service Julie Comstock, and Vice President Public Affairs Lisa Olson, which includes a discussion on compensation matters. With respect to the enterprise risk management, the discussions involve matters that are confidential and protected by the attorney-client privilege with the attorney work product doctrine, and which involve the discussion for security for district property and utility infrastructure information. With respect to the corporate officer's performance reviews, a closed session is necessary to prevent needless injury to the reputations of the individuals involved, and the senior managers have not requested a public meeting.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a second.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Barrett?
Yes.
Kavanaugh?
Yes.
Gay?
Yes.
McGuire?
Yes.
Mines?
Yes.
Moody?
Yes.
Trinan?
Yes.
Yoder?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Okay, the motion to go into closed session is passed. This closed session will be limited to an update on enterprise risk management and corporate officers' performance reviews and compensation matters. No votes or board action will be taken during the closed session. And upon conclusion of our executive session, that will conclude the committee meetings.